For the last several years, especially since Raúl Castro took over from his older brother Fidel in 2006, and then officially in 2008, a lot of changes are taking place in Cuba, changes which are varied. Some of them could be considered reforms, some of them are just changes. And that's one issue we might want to discuss later during the discussion period. But I think if we try to take a global look at those changes, I think they're aiming for what I would call a Sino-Vietnamese model with Cuban characteristics. That is to the adaptation of that model. And when I say the Sino-Vietnamese model, I mean a kind of state capitalism where political authoritarianism remains, but in an economy that has taken important capitalist features, but where the state still retains a very strong economic role, as it is in the case of particularly China. I'll just say that right now, already some 24% of the labor force in Cuba is cuentapropistas, meaning working for themselves. And by the end of the 5-year plan that was adopted at the Congress that took place in April, it's supposed to be 40%. So we're talking, so there are significant changes in Cuba that cannot be any doubt. As one thing, however, and trying to look at it as a whole and not just get lost in the myriad of things that happen every other week, is that I'm really impressed by the fact that in all the discussions about the changes and reforms in Cuba, particularly in the economic field, and particularly the ones that were adopted at the Six-Party Congress that took place April of 2011, there is one major section of that program adopted at the Congress that has barely been mentioned. Very little discussion of that, and to me is the most central element of that program, even though it has not yet been implemented. And that is what the program says about enterprise autonomy. And when they talk about enterprise autonomy, they're talking about the autonomy of the managers, not the autonomy of the workers, of course. And essentially what they're talking about is no more state subsidies for enterprises, which is the kind of economy that exists in Cuba and existed in the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. Enterprises are continually asking for supplemental funds for reasons that I cannot go into right now. So they're going to suspend any subsidies for enterprises, create bankruptcy for state enterprises. By the way, that only came to happen in China quite a few years after the reforms that began in 1978. I think it was the 1990s, some 12 years after the Deng reforms began in the late 70s, that state bankruptcy for state enterprises was adopted in China. And once the enterprises are bankrupt, then they will be transferred either to private property or to perhaps some form of cooperatives. And also, as part of this part of the program, they talk about the decentralization of prices. That is, prices will no longer be determined by the central authorities, or some prices, which of course opens the road to competition among state firms and competition between state firms and private firms. Now, why do I pick on this aspect of the program that has been talked about very little? In part, to be fair, because it hasn't yet been put into practice, but it is certainly part of the program. But I think the reason that I pick on it is because that part of the party program perfectly complements and responds, in my view, to the needs and demands and desires of a very important section of the Cuban bureaucracy, which are the managers and technicians in the joint venture enterprises with foreign capital. Even more important than that is the enterprises of the armed forces in Cuba that are organized on the GAESA, which is the name of the enterprises of the armed forces, And you should keep in mind that when we're talking about the economic activity of the armed forces in Cuba, particularly the Army, we're talking about half of the economy. Half of the Cuban economy is run by either present or retired Army officers. They have become businessmen in uniform, you see. And sometimes they don't even wear a uniform, but you know, they come from that source. And GAESA, which is the GAESA, which is the overall organization in the armed forces that runs its economic enterprises, particularly tourist enterprises such as Gaviota, which is the single largest tourist enterprise in Cuba. At the head of GAESA now is a man called Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Callejas. He has a very long name. He's a major, and he happens to be a son-in-law of Raúl Castro. And he was just promoted to the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party at the Congress that just took place in April. So, so this part of the program, in combination with the existence of this cadre of people, which are quite significant, in my view, creates the possibility of a transformation of the ruling group, especially in the context of a transition after both Castro brothers have gone from the scene. Keep in mind that Fidel Castro is 85 and Raúl is 80. So we're talking about people that have only so many years, biologically speaking, ahead of it. So on this I see as the center of what will be a Sino-Vietnamese model implemented in Cuba. Because it's at the real enterprises, you know, people understandably have been sidelined by the fact that now you can buy a hamburger, you can buy guarapo, which is sugar cane juice in Cuba from a cuenta propista. You know, and there are lots of those people, and the appearance, Havana's appearance has changed dramatically because there are all these petty entrepreneurs out there selling things. But economically speaking, they are not very meaningful or significant compared to the enterprises that GAESA runs. So appearances can be deceiving. What, you know, the situation looks, when you go to Havana and see all these new situation of the and small shopkeepers and so on, that's deceiving when what it really counts is likely to be transformed if the party program is carried out. Now, why this change? Why this change in Cuba? And I think there's a very simple reason for that. From the point of view of the leadership that wants to survive and prosper, obviously, and given that from the point of view of the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party, and particularly the armed forces, they are not the workers' democracy is nothing. It's nothing that they would consider. You know, enterprise autonomy by the workers is not something they would consider. That's not even in their mental map. They have to find another way of having the system survive. The Cuban system, as it was working under pre-Raúl Castro's rule, and continues to be because most of the system still works under state enterprises, is a system of very low productivity, deterioration, has tremendous deterioration of trade balance, and very important capital loss, that is an economy that eats its own capital base. And there is no USSR to bail the country out, and the role of Venezuela is very iffy for reasons that I cannot go into now, because then I would be here 2 hours instead of half an hour, and you would kill me. So they have no choice. So the question is, why the mess in this Cuban economy, in this centralized bureaucratic economy? Why the mess? Is it the blockade? No question about the fact that the blockade of the American blockade, which is a criminal blockade, and let's be clear about that, and you know, and has to go. So there should be no ambiguity on that issue. At the beginning of the blockade, it made tremendous damage, and it's no question that today, were the blockade to be removed, you know, there probably be almost 1 million additional tourists in Cuba. There will be American participation in the exploration for oil in the Cuban waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Clearly we made a difference. But I think that at least as important as the blockade, and probably more important the blockade from an economic point of view, is the disastrous bureaucratic economic system. A system that has no meaningful incentives. You know, the old saying from Eastern Europe that workers pretend to work and the bureaucrats pretend to pay them, you know, applies definitely to Cuba. It's a system of unbelievable waste, examples of which are in chapter 2 of my book. Yet that system does a few things rather well. I think most things it doesn't do well at all, but some things it does rather well. And here's where I give a try. I'm not building some great system here or anything like that, but I think that Charles Lindblom, who's a political scientist, I don't know if he's still alive, you know, from Yale, he wrote a book in the late 70s called Politics and Markets, where he makes an interesting analogy between what he calls strong thumbs and no fingers. And what he means by strong thumbs, referring to an economy, is an economy that is able to do homogeneous, routinized, repetitive tasks fairly well. But when it comes to variation, improvisation, initiatives to deal with unforeseen situations, it does very, very badly. Thus, strong thumbs of the Cuban economy allows for the massive vaccination campaigns that you say in the first grade or whatever, the kindergarten, whatever, on such and such a date, children are going to be vaccinated, and they line up and they are vaccinated. It's a repetitive task, a very important, obviously, and useful task. It's a repetitive task. A lot of preventive medicine, and Cuba has done pretty well on health, is of that nature. It is not the highly sophisticated orientation of American medicine to prolong an 80-year-old person's life another 3 years. You know, it is preventive and so on. A lot of the activities, and obviously generalizing and simplifying, but I want to make that point. The economy with strong thumbs allows for a civil defense system that when they approach a hurricane, and Cuba is very affected by hurricanes, then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps that are taken with a military precision practically, and people are sheltered, unlike the scandalous criminal neglect of what happened in New Orleans in 2005. So those things the system does fairly well. When it comes, however, to consumer goods, when it comes, however, to particularly agriculture, it's a disaster. Because, and I think agriculture, which I discuss in my book also, it's particularly that area of the economy. It's no accident that the East European economies were a disaster when it came to agriculture as well. When it comes to that, it's precisely the necessity for initiatives, for variation in reaction to changing conditions that are especially important in agriculture. And Cuban agriculture has been a disaster. The problem of food in Cuba has been a very major one, and one of the things that the population suffers most. After I finished my book talking about consumer goods, there was an interesting example of the problem with consumer goods in Cuba, and that was the state provides school uniforms to children in Cuba. A good thing, obviously, but in the academic year that started September 2011, all of a sudden there were no short sizes. There was a shortage of short sizes for children. So mothers, and it's typically mothers who do that, had to buy larger sizes and go to this newly group of private seamsters and so on and pay them to adapt the long pants or skirts to the children, because there were no short sizes, or not enough. to solve. That's typical of this kind of economies when it comes to variation, discrimination, variety, and so on. Now, so we're talking then about an economic system that it's a disaster, and that's why. So when they go the Sino-Vietnamese road, they don't go because Raúl Castro fell in love with China, although he's very sympathetic to China, as a matter of fact, but because it's an available model to them given the desperate situation in which they find themselves. Now, if we go beyond the economy, we can see that since the 90s, that is farther back than Raúl Castro, or rather than Fidel Castro, since the 90s, but more recently, there has been a process of liberalization in Cuba, but not democratization. And the two things should not be confused. When I talk about liberalization, I'm talking about the retreat or withdrawal of the all-encompassing Leviathan that is the Cuban state from certain activities, mostly in the economy, and to a lesser degree in the political area, which I will refer to in a minute. That is the allowing by now 24% of the Cuban labor force to be self-employed. It clearly marks a withdrawal of the state from total control, particularly in retail trade and agriculture in particular. So clearly that's a more liberal state, relatively speaking, than it was before. In the classical meaning of liberal, let do, laissez-faire, let do. In the European sense, if you will, because American liberalism has a different meaning. I don't mean in the American sense. In the political area, there has been also a kind of liberalization, much less significant in my view than in the economic area, much less, but a liberalization that has allowed more elbow room for some elite groups in society. And when I talk about elite groups in society, I mean artists, I mean intellectuals, I mean academics. So therefore, you can have fairly decent, some of them even high quality, small circulation journals in Cuba, and temas, T-E-M-A-S, or themes in English, temas in Spanish. It's an example of that. It's probably, it's not, I would say it's the single most important intellectual journal in Cuba. And if you look at temas, which again, it's a small circulation journal. This is read by academics and intellectuals. That's the people who read, and some highly educated people with university degrees and most likely graduate degrees, not even BAs. So what is interesting about temas, you will find very good articles, for example, on empirical material on racial inequality in Cuba. And, very useful empirical, or just inequality in general. There's an excellent social scientist in Cuba called Mayra Espina Prieto, who's really good, and you find these articles, but when it comes to interpretation of that material, of that data, then of course they get a little cautious. I mean, we're talking about assessing the role of the political leadership in the problems I discuss and forget it. That is not going to be discussed in an article in temas. It's as simple as that. Nevertheless, a lot of the stuff is very much worth reading in temas as compared to the mass media, which is an absolute drudgery. So there has been then a lot of economic liberalization, less intellectual and political liberalization, more for these elite groups in society, but fundamentally the political system has remained unchanged. There has been no democratization whatsoever in the political system. The one-party state and its mass organizations, because when we talk about the one-party state, we're talking about the transmission belts for the one-party state, which is a single official, I mean a little more than that, a single official trade union organization, a single official women's organization, you know. Those are and they are written into the Constitution, the Cuban Constitution. The press, so therefore no independent organization can be legal in Cuba. Some occur and they're tolerated, but until the leadership says out with you and you're out, you know. So there's a certain degree of toleration, but of groups that are fundamentally illegal because they have no basis in law. There is a registry for organizations in Cuba, and if you're not legitimate in the register of organizations in one of the ministries, then you are exposed to be disbanded at any moment, even though you may be tolerated. The mass media is absolutely dreadful. The newspapers, magazines, you know, not the few thousand who read temas, but the hundreds of thousands who read Revolución, Juventud Rebelde, to a lesser extent Trabajadores, but particular Revolución, Grama, you know, Revolución, that's an interesting slip, you know. That was the antecessor of Grama. Grama, Juventud Rebelde, which are the major publications in Cuba, whatever is said there is what is permitted by the Department of Ideology of the Cuban Communist Party, which sends its quote-unquote orientations to these newspapers, and this is run by a man called Rolando Alfonso Borges, who is in the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, and he's the head of the ideology section of the Cuban Communist Party, and he's the one who sends instructions. I'm sure he discussed it with Raúl and so on, of course, but he's the one who's in charge of running this ideological show. Now, in my book, I discuss in detail the farce of Poder Popular, the farce of the so-called pre-Congress, the discussion that took place preceding the Cuban Communist Party Congress. That is discussed in detail. But what I want to make clear is that my objections to the one-party state is not from the point of view of a political scientist, a sociologist, or whatever, who legitimately, by the way, may want to discuss what might be the desirable party system in a socialist society. That's a totally legitimate discussion, but that is not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from opposition to the legal and constitutional monopoly and the inadmissibility of that in a socialist society or any other kind of society that pretends to be democratic, where the Constitution of Cuba sets up the Cuban Communist Party and its mass organizations as the only legitimate organization in the country. And administrative and repressive methods are used to make sure that that is not challenged. So instead of that, I'm not saying, I don't know whether on the socials it will be 1, 2, or 5 or 6 parties. What I'm saying is let the actual life of the society determine that in practice. Let the actual social conflicts in the society determine how many parties we need. In their free play of the conflictual life in the society. Now, let me shift gears and explore a couple of themes that are relevant to the issues of racism, sexism, and homophobia. And that is, I want to speak in the remaining time I have to the position that a little less recently, but throughout most of the history of Cuban communism, which is well over 50 years now, the whole approach to racism and sexism was that it was a leftover from the capitalist and pre-capitalist past. That is, you blame Spain and blame the colonial heritage and then capitalism. Because keep in mind, you know, Spanish control in Cuba was very late, until 1898, which is some 70-something years after most of Hispanic America became independent. Cuba became, the Spanish left Cuba in 1898. And what I want to say is that both in terms of racism as well as sexism, it is true. No question about the fact that there is a colonial and capitalist inheritance, of course. But there is also new aspects, new institutional realities of Cuban communism with a capital C that create its own sources of racial and gender discrimination. And this is why, for example, if we look at racism in Cuba, it is true that the Cuban Revolution in its initial years Before, in 1962, it declared that racism had been solved and we don't need to talk about it anymore. An attitude that has only been changed, what, 5-6 years ago. Now it's part of the liberalization. Now you can talk about racism in Cuba. Not about organizing independently against it. That you cannot talk about, but you can, just like the articles in Temas do. But for most of the history of the Cuban capital C communism, racism was a non-issue. But the fact is that the realities in housing, in the media, the Cuban media, it's like you would think that it's a white country, you know, which is true for the rest of Latin America, by the way. You know, I go a lot to Mexico because my wife is Mexican. In Mexico, you look at the telenovelas and you look at the ads. Hey, what country is this? Very similar in Cuba, you know. So the media, the correctional system. Cuba is not, or was, number 5, maybe a little lower now because 5% of the common prisoners were released at Christmas Day last year after the book was published. But that's a marginal change. You know, Cuba, until then, it was number 5, now it might be number 6 or 7, you know. In the ratio of common prisoners per 100,000 people. Very high number of common prisoners and disproportionately black. So these are realities that cannot be blamed on Spanish colonialism nor on American controlled capitalism, which lasted some 60, 70 years. It is particularly offensive to me when Fidel Castro gives an interview to the editor of La Jornada, which is a Mexican daily, and claims that, yes, I admit responsibility for homophobia in Cuba during the revolutionary period. And then when Carmen Lira, who is the editor, asked it, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I was negligent. I claim responsibility because I was negligent. I was concerned with pressing matters of imperialism and so on, and I didn't pay attention to this. That's an outright lie. I mean, an outright lie, because there was an infamous speech that Fidel Castro gave on March 13th, 1963, on the 6th anniversary of the failed attack on the presidential palace. This was a speech at the University of Havana. So March 13th is the day you give a speech at the University of Havana, because that was the source of that particular movement. It wasn't the 26th of July movement. It was Directorio Revolucionario. And at that speech, he said things, well, older homosexuals, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, we're not going to allow the young to join, be recruited. Okay, we're not going to allow that. Not only that, but homosexuality, says Castro, March 13th, 1963, homosexuality. When I was in the country fighting the guerrillas, I never ran into homosexuals there. That's an urban problem. With the implication, because it's part of the larger anti-urban bias in the Cuban leadership, that it's urban degeneracy, really, that brings about homosexuality. And that was Fidel Castro speaking. That's not the only speech, but that is the most infamous speech, if you will. So he's just outright lying when he said he was just being negligent and didn't pay attention to the problem. He certainly paid attention. He paid attention on the wrong side of the issue, which is a different matter, So I don't. Things have to change for the better in Cuba in the last since the 90s, and I discuss that in my book. CENESEX, which is the institution dealing with questions of sexual education, which is led by Mariela Castro, who is a daughter of Raúl Castro, has done good work. I will be the last person to deny it. But the fundamental issue in Cuba, whether we're talking about gays, in the case of women, one of the biggest problems of women today in Cuba is, first of all, the double burden, where there's a very important article in Temas, which I quote in my book, showing studies from ONE, which is the National Institute of Statistics. They did a study about actually what domestic work is done by men and women, and they have very conclusive figures that women do the lion's share of domestic work. And the majority of Cuban women by far in the labor force, so they're doing double duty, just like in Eastern Europe. Like it was the case there. So you have the question of the double shift, the double burden, and you have a question which is has been a lot of reference has been made in Cuba in the press recently to the domestic violence against women. And you cannot rely on same-sex and much less the the Federation of Cuban Women. You cannot rely on them when they decide to fight something. Cuban women independently have to be able to fight those issues without waiting for the government to say, now you can protest, now you can fight it. They have to be able to organize themselves. And of course, the same applies to black people, because there are new realities that have created these problems in Cuba, not just the inheritance of colonialism and capitalism. Now finally, since I think my time ran out, I just want to say a couple of things about the way forward. And I think that in terms of the way forward, first, I said it once before this talk, but I want to repeat it again, which is essential, is that the future, a decent future for Cuba can only happen if the United States government keeps its hands off Cuba. Let's make no mistake about it. There can be no ambiguity about that. There can be no equivocation about that issue. And that means the abolition of the blockade, of the repeal of the Helms-Burton law, etc., etc., etc. There can be no doubt about that. Fortunately, there is a nascent left wing in Cuba that I've tried to relate to it. That if you look at HavanaTimes.org, which is a website which is both Spanish and in English, you will see some of the unfortunately, the great majority of people in Cuba have no access to the internet, so very few people in Cuba can read the stuff, which is maybe the reason why they're allowed to exist, because it has really no, unfortunately, no impact on the population. But I think that's a important development, that there are people, there is a broad left, people with very different points of view, which form this milieu in Cuba, to which, of course, I try to relate as much as I can. And I think that if they want to move forward, as I said in an interview that was conducted by Armando Chaguacera, who's one of the people who write for Havana Times, they have to be able to relate to the struggles that are bound to occur in Cuba, particularly to the degree that this model of the Sino-Vietnamese model is implemented, because all the transitions to whether state capitalism or just straight capitalism have been at the expense of the working class and poor people. Make no mistake about that. So if this new left that is emerging in Cuba, very small yet, but there is something there, the only way, in my humble opinion, and I cannot, from New York, in the comfort of New York, I'm a retired professor here telling them what to do. That would be absurd and wrong, ethically and morally and politically wrong. But I certainly, when asked, I give my opinions. And I think that that milieu has a tendency, what I call culturalist politics, and I think which is nothing wrong with it, but they have to move into a more class-oriented politics if in fact they're going to make a mark on Cuban society. But the fundamental thing is that those issues are for Cubans to decide, not for us here, and most certainly not for the government here. Thank you very much.